What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 16 Christmas Sunday games. Merry Christmas, everyone! Sleeper picks.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to give you some of my top DFS picks for this Sunday slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 16, Merry Christmas. Let's take a look at this 3-game Sunday slate. So at the quarterback position, there's 3 quarterbacks that I like. I like Tua Tagovailoa, Tom Brady, and Aaron Rodgers. All 3 of those guys are playing for teams that are still fighting to make it into the playoffs, whereas Russell Wilson from the Denver Broncos and Baker Mayfield from the LA Rams, the Broncos and the Rams have both been eliminated from the playoffs, plus they're not good matchups, and those guys have their ceiling relatively limited as well. So I'm going to write off Russell Wilson and Baker Mayfield in this game, because if I'm going to pay in the $5,000 range, he's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel. I'm going to pay up for Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 4th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers has averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 1.6 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 20% owned, projected at 16.6 fantasy points here today, but I do think he can score 19 fantasy points or more in this matchup, fighting for his playoff life. I know he doesn't have the best wide receivers, but he can get it done. He's an accurate passer, obviously very good under pressure, so he's going to benefit from these last couple of games where they're fighting for their playoff life and every play matters. You're going to want Aaron Rodgers behind the football, just like you're going to want Tom Brady, and we'll see about Tua Tagovailoa, but he's been playing pretty well this season. But back to Aaron Rodgers, he's only $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, with the Green Bay Packers trailing by 3.5. So a super high scoring game, fantastic matchup. Looks like they think the Packers are going to be trailing just by about a field goal or so throughout the game. And that's going to put some pressure on Aaron Rodgers to continue to score. Miami Dolphins, they can score a lot of points. So Aaron Rodgers, he's only scored 12, 14, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 3, 3, and 1 rush attempts in those games. So it doesn't rush the ball all that much, but he can scramble when he needs to. Now, he's been underperforming his season average this year. Just doesn't have a lot of weapons, but he does have an emerging wide receiver in Christian Watson. So I do think he's going to have enough to score a couple of touchdowns, throw for 300 plus yards here in what Vegas thinks is going to be a high scoring game. And it's just such a good matchup and a low price tag. So I like Aaron Rodgers here versus the Miami Dolphins. Now the next guy I like, only 200 more, also fighting for his playoff life and super good under the pressure. You could say he's the best under pressure in all of the NFL ever. So I like Tom Brady from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tom Brady has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 1.7 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 26% owned, projected at 18.3 fantasy points here today. And I think Tom Brady can score 22 plus fantasy points. He is awesome under pressure, and he needs to win this game to keep their playoff hopes alive. It's a great matchup here. And Tom Brady's only 6,100 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Bucks favored by 7.5. So Tom Brady has scored 24, 12, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 2, 2, and 1 rush attempt in those games. So none of the fantasy quarterbacks I like this week rush the ball all that much, but they are accurate passers and got good matchups. And Tom Brady does have the weapons. He's just been struggling this year, has had a lot to deal with off of the field. But I do think he closes out this season super strong in Tom Brady-like fashion. We saw it last week with 24 fantasy points. Now he's got a good matchup. I think it's a good game script as well. So I like Tom Brady here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Now the quarterback with the most dangerous weapons on the slate is Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins, playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa has had a fantastic season, averaging 19.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 1.9 rush attempts per game. Going to be about 33% owned, projected at 19.2 fantasy points here today. And he's 7,000 DraftKings salary, 2,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 3.5. Tua Tagovailoa has scored 18, 13, and 17 fantasy points in his last 3 games. He got 1, 3, and 0 rush attempts in those games, so he's underperformed his season average in the past 3 weeks. Now, I do think he can score 20 plus fantasy points here. It should be a high scoring game, and I do expect Aaron Rodgers to be able to score some touchdowns here and keep pressure on Tua Tagovailoa to continue to score the ball. I think that's why Vegas thinks it's going to be a high scoring game here, so I'll absolutely have a piece of this game. So I like Tua Tagovailoa here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the stud on the slate is Aaron Jones from the Green Bay Packers, playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 4th worst defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Aaron Jones has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.9 rush attempts per game and 4.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 31% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here today. He's 7,500 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, with the Packers trailing by 3.5. Aaron Jones has scored 22, 10, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 17, 9, and 12 rush attempts, on top of 5, 5, and 4 pass targets. So I like Aaron Jones here versus the Miami Dolphins.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Now, maybe my favorite play on the slate at running back, I hope I'm not being suckered into this, because he only got 14 touches last week, but that was coming off a game that he got 21 touches, and in both of the past 2 weeks, he scored over 20 fantasy points. Actually, for the past 3 weeks, he's averaging 20 fantasy points or more, and his salary is still low. So if you don't want to go with Aaron Jones for 7,500, you want to save some salary at this position, take a look at A.J. Dillon from the Green Bay Packers. The Miami Dolphins have the 4th worst defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. So A.J. Dillon has scored 22, 21, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 11, 18, and 8 rush attempts on top of 3, 3, and 4 pass targets. So you can see that the Green Bay Packers have been leaning on the run, going to both Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. And I've noticed A.J. Dillon does get a lot of the goal line carries if they got a first and goal on the 1 or the 5. Usually they'll pound it with A.J. Dillon a couple of times, and he's pretty good at making those short yardage plays, which gives him a lot of fantasy upside. And he's still only $5,700 DraftKings salary. He's $1,100 more on FanDuel. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, so I like getting a piece of this game. This is a low salary way to do it, to get a guy that's got 20 plus fantasy point upside. So I like A.J. Dillon here versus the Miami Dolphins. Okay, now it gets a little dicey here when you go to the other running backs on the slate that I think are worth playing. So for the Tampa Bay Bucks, you have Leonard Fournette and Rachaad White. So they're going to be sharing the carries, but they're not getting as much volume as Green Bay running backs are. So they're going to be looking at somewhere around 10 to 15 touches apiece, and they're going to be touchdown dependent most likely. So if Leonard Fournette gets the touchdown, he'll probably hit value. If Rachaad White gets the touchdown, he'll probably hit value. They're both pretty reasonably priced here. Leonard Fournette at $5,800 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. Rachaad White at $5,300 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel. I lean towards Leonard Fournette a little bit here. It is a great matchup. The Arizona Cardinals have the second worst defense overall, give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I like Leonard Fournette. I also like Rachaad White if you want to save a little money, or if your lineup just comes down to it where you can only fit in Rachaad White over Leonard Fournette. I think that's a good play. So I like those guys. Now, the running back that I think is in the best position this week, if he can pull it together, is Raheem Mostert from the Miami Dolphins, playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, Raheem Mostert, he's only averaged 10.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.8 rush attempts per game, 2.2 pass targets per game. So the volume hasn't really been there throughout the season, and he hasn't really performed all that well. He's had some decent games, but he did have a great game last game, where he got 17 rush attempts and 2 pass targets and scored 20 fantasy points. So he's coming off of a strong performance, and he's got a great matchup. He's going to be about 29% owned, projected at 11.6 fantasy points here today, but I think he can score 15 fantasy points or more, and he's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. Lots of good players to play in this game. And like I said, Raheem Mostert has scored 20 fantasy points last game off of 17 rush attempts and 2 pass targets. Now, he is competing for touches or carries with Jeff Wilson Jr., but Jeff Wilson Jr. was limited in practice on Friday. So if Jeff Wilson Jr. is out, then absolutely Raheem Mostert to me is a must start with that matchup, and looking at probably 20 plus touches again. But if Jeff Wilson Jr. does play, then it makes it a coin flip here. It pretty much makes it look like the Leonard Fournette, Rachaad White situation. We're going to have Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. sharing the load or sharing carries. So if Jeff Wilson Jr. is out, I love Raheem Mostert. If Jeff Wilson Jr. is in, and it looks like he's going to, if they don't say he's limited or anything, then I think it's a coin flip, but I prefer Raheem Mostert at full strength here. I think he will out-touch Jeff Wilson Jr. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So we got a handful of studs on the slate at the wide receiver position, but most of them don't have very good matchups. They're facing teams that have been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers. But let's take a look at the stud on the slate, Tyreek Hill from the Miami Dolphins, playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, but Tyreek Hill has averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.9 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 76% of the snaps. He's going to be about 50% owned, projected at 25.1 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 9,000 DraftKings salary, only 100 more on FanDuel, and Tyreek Hill has scored 22, 24, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 13, 10, and 14 pass targets. So monster volume, monster production. So I like Tyreek Hill here versus the Green Bay Packers. Now coming down in salary, and you're coming down quite a bit. You're coming down 1,500 on DraftKings here. Take a look at DeAndre Hopkins from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins has averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 20% owned, projected at 14.8 fantasy points here today. I think he can score 18 fantasy points or more. He's 7,500 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals trailing by 7.5. So nice passing game script here potentially for the Arizona Cardinals. DeAndre Hopkins has scored 13, 14, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 11, and 6 pass targets. So I like DeAndre Hopkins here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks.
Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. So the other deep threat for the Miami Dolphins is Jalen Waddle, and he's 7,200 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 29% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here today. He's 7,200 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. And Jalen Waddle has scored 23, 5, and 2 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 7, 4, and 5 pass targets. So Jalen Waddle was out with injury for a few weeks. He came back and he wasn't really full strength, but he played a couple of games, got a couple games under his belt, and it looks like he's finally back to his fully healthy Jalen Waddle self with 7 pass targets and 23 fantasy points last week. So he is plenty capable of putting up big numbers, just like Tyreek Hill, and you're getting him at a major discount to Tyreek Hill. So I like Jalen Waddle here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, now the next 2 wide receivers are from the Tampa Bay Bucks. I think you can flip a coin on these guys as well. So Chris Godwin has gotten a little more volume throughout the season, and he's also been a little bit more productive. He's averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 32% owned, He's 6,900 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel, whereas Mike Evans has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 28% owned, projected at 13.5 fantasy points here today. And he's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. So both of these guys have had up and down games. Chris Godwin has been more consistent, whereas Mike Evans tends to be more boom or bust. But Mike Evans did get 10 pass targets last game, scored 13 fantasy points. Chris Godwin got 8 pass targets last game, scored 22 fantasy points. I think this could be an interesting stack with Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, and Mike Evans. I am expecting Brady to bring his A game to keep his team in the playoff hunt. So I like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Now, if you're looking for the wide receiver that's going to catch the ball from Aaron Rodgers, his emerging favorite target is Christian Watson. So Christian Watson has averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.3 pass targets per game. But that's come up the past 3 games, and he's going to be about 29% owned, projected at 12.3 fantasy points here today. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,700 more on FanDuel. Christian Watson has scored 9, 24, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 6 pass targets in each of those games. So I like Christian Watson here versus the Miami Dolphins. And another wide receiver that I like quite a bit due to some injuries here is Jerry Jeudy, because Courtland Sutton is questionable. He was limited in practice. Kendall Hinton is out. He's been ruled out. So they're banged up at the wide receiver position. So that's going to give Jerry Jeudy all the opportunity he can handle. So I like Jerry Jeudy from the Denver Broncos playing the LA Rams, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy has averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 20% owned, projected at 13.3 fantasy points here today. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas does think this is going to be a low-scoring game. 36.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos favored by 3. Which reminds me that maybe playing the Denver Broncos or the Rams defense. So Jerry Jeudy has scored 15, 33, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 9, and 4 pass targets. So I like Jerry Jeudy here versus the LA Rams. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I like Tyler Higbee from the LA Rams playing the Denver Broncos, who have a good defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Tyler Higbee has averaged 7.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 24% owned, projected at 7.6 fantasy points here today. He's been on the field for 86% of the snaps. He's 4,100 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. And Tyler Higbee, he scored 13 fantasy points last week off of 5 pass targets. So I like Tyler Higbee here versus the Denver Broncos. So other tight ends that I think you could play, Greg Dulcich, Trey McBride. I think there's an injury there in the Arizona Cardinals. No, Trey McBride is their #1 tight end, and he's had some pretty decent volume over the past 2 or 3 weeks. So I think that does make him an interesting play, a risky play, but he's got a great matchup here. So Trey McBride from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Now, Trey McBride has scored 10 and 6 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 5 and 6 pass targets. He's going to be about 12% owned. He's 3,200 DraftKings salary, 1,600 more on FanDuel. So I think he's an interesting play here. So I think Trey McBride is a decent sleeper pick here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. And another sleeper pick that I have at the tight end position is Cameron Brate from the Tampa Bay Bucks, playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Cameron Brate has averaged 4.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 13% owned, projected at 4.6 fantasy points here today. He's only 2,900 DraftKings salary, 1,600 more on FanDuel, and he was injured for quite a bit of the season. He's come back and he's played the last 2 weeks, scored 5 and 3 fantasy points off of 4 and 4 pass targets. So his volume is pretty decent for 2,900 DraftKings salary, and he has a fantastic matchup. So I like Cameron Brate as a sleeper pick here versus the Arizona Cardinals. And I guess you don't want to forget Robert Tonyan from the Green Bay Packers. He's got a fantastic matchup, and he's averaging 4.1 pass targets per game on the season and 6.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He's trailed off the past 3 weeks, hasn't done much, but I do think he's in a good spot this week, and he's going to be about 21% owned. He's only 3,700 DraftKings salary, and we know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, and it's a fantastic matchup. So I think he's a pretty good play at tight end as well. So I like Robert Tonyan here versus the Miami Dolphins.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.